So to begin, I begin with a story about one of my clients. Last Monday morning, the 10th of October, as I think a lot of you will remember, Kiev was hit. I have a client I'll call Katya, and I just want to specify that all the names I use, I have changed, and I've changed any details that might identify individuals. So I have a client I'll call Katya, who returned to Kiev with her 18-year-old daughter 3 months ago. I began working with her in March when she came to a town not far from where I live in the Alps as a refugee with her daughter. And we met weekly for therapy. Last Monday morning, I got a message from her saying that Kiev was being shelled and she was terrified and the explosions wouldn't stop. Her daughter, who's 18, had gone to the university campus in the center and she had told her to stay put. Her daughter, Natasha, is the reason why Katya decided to go back to Kiev so rapidly. And also, there's also the consideration that people were saying that Kiev was safe, something that perhaps changed for a lot of people last Monday. Natasha is a very strong student and she had got a fully funded place at a really good university in Ukraine to study psychology. And Katya really wanted her to begin her university career in person after 2 years of online learning due to the pandemic. She wanted her to make friends and to attend lectures in person and not miss out on the beginning of her university life and adulthood. And so they went back. There was also the consideration that if she was going to stay in France and learn French and study in France, that would probably mean committing to a life in France. And both of them are deeply attached to their country and did not want that. And Natasha has a boyfriend who's serving in the army, and whenever he has leave, he comes to Kiev to visit her. They live with Katya's boyfriend of 7 years in an apartment in Kiev. And Katya's not a linguist, she's a beautician. And until March, she had her own beauty clinic that she shut down because of the war, and she hasn't yet managed to reopen it. Too much uncertainty, too much risk. Last Monday, Katya was talking to me potentially about returning to France. Now, Katya did not like being a refugee, and perhaps that sounds like an obvious statement, but I have met those for whom it has been an opportunity, very few, who have really embraced it and seen it as an opportunity to change their life. Most of the Ukrainians I work with have been dying to go home. They're desperately uncomfortable and out of place in France, and they spend their life online looking at the hourly developments of the war in Ukraine. This uncertainty and the constant news is deeply unsettling. The sense of not knowing whether it's safe to stay or whether one should leave, the experience once one leaves of not having a home, of having no certain income, of not speaking the language, of not knowing how to navigate the bureaucracy of the country you've arrived in to gain the correct papers and benefits to survive. The mass thrownness of this experience is like something I've never known in my work as a psychotherapist. And I'm used to working with voluntary migrants, what Greg Madison in The End of Belonging refers to as existential migrants. And I think it's important to just make that distinction here. Madison's cohort are those with the qualifications, the means, and the freedom to travel and settle with dignity. And that means to support oneself, to feel safe, to choose to leave and move somewhere else if you want to. Those who voluntarily leave home to become a stranger in a strange land. Madison admits he's one of them. He writes, "We are living paradoxes. We need to feel at home, but have never done so. We need to belong, but we renounce opportunities for belonging. We venture out into the unknown in order to experience the homecoming that will finally settle us, but doesn't." There's an important distinction here, and it's one of choice. Separate to my therapeutic work with the Ukrainians, we have been hosting and caring for the relatives of a very dear friend of mine from Nikolaev since the war broke out. Nikolaev has been very hard hit. You may have read that they don't have any clean or safe drinking water. The grandmother in the family, who's 68, has talked to me a lot about her experience of leaving home, and I found it really valuable to listen to her, perhaps partly because I am a voluntary migrant myself and don't have that sense of attachment to a fixed place. She didn't want to leave. She's desperate to return. And it's been an incredibly painful journey for her. I share some of her reflections in this experience here with her permission. Do you think home is somewhere you ever really leave? I mean, even when you die. When I left, when we got in that car, I sat down, looked back, and I thought, this is it. This is goodbye. I was 10 when they got that apartment. I was in the 5th year. This apartment created you and you created it. You've renovated it time and time again, preserved old objects that were there before you. The rest you chose yourself, every last detail, years and years, your entire life. You've lived here. You've experienced every different mood here, held parties, celebrated birthdays, mourned loved ones, raised children. When a person dies, you're meant to cover the mirror. Do you know why that is? It's because the spirit is meant to stay in the house for 40 days. And if you leave a mirror uncovered and the spirit sees itself in the mirror, it might be tempted to stay longer because no one wants to leave their home. No one. When children used to die, they wouldn't bury them. They'd immure them, bury them in the walls, and then they're trapped in the house forever. In a way, I envy them. As a voluntary migrant myself, who has spent only 4 out of the 23 years since my first degree in my home, in my country of birth, the UK, and who left home by choice, age 15, I found this description of home deeply moving. The home I grew up in still visits me occasionally in my nightmares. It wasn't until I had children that I realized on reflection how unsafe my childhood home was in many respects. Perhaps because of this, home is deeply relational for me. It is the quality of the safe and loving connections we foster between ourselves as a family and carry with us everywhere we go. In my adult life, I've only ever had a temporary sense of physical home, a temporary sense of belonging to a physical place, staying put in one culture, one country. For 18 years, I have been foreign. My children have always been foreign. And strangely, the only apartment that fully felt like home was in a country I did not feel safe in, Russia. This is the view from the window of that apartment in Moscow. And when I really look at it, it takes me back to the relationships I forged there, the moments that will never be recovered. It has a different significance today, as since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I have the sensation that I will never go back to Moscow. Considering my experience in working with Ukrainian refugees, I am often amazed by their resilience. If you have a strong and consistent sense of physical and emotional home your entire life, and your home is taken from you from one day to the next, how do you survive that? If you're forced to leave behind loved ones who themselves cannot leave, or to leave them in a hurry, how do you keep going? If having left, you have constant updates on your phone about attacks on your hometown that may potentially destroy your home and hurt the people you love or kill the people you love, what does that do to you on a psychic and emotional level? My very personal interest in these questions would explain, I've realized, why I feel so at home in my work with the plight of refugees. And this year, I have felt an enormous sense of personal meaning in this work, not only in the therapeutic work, but with the family we have been supporting as a family, people yearning for home while living in our home. Those people have had a profound effect on every member of my family. When I mentioned to my 14-year-old son that I was giving this talk tonight and asked if he wanted to turn his computer on and listen to it, he said he didn't need to. He's an expert in refugees because he's been doing field work all year. So refugees feel the thrownness of their existence more starkly than any other group I've ever worked with. And for those not from an existential training background, I wanted to briefly explain for a minute why I find this concept so useful in my understanding of involuntary migrants. For the German existential philosopher Martin Heidegger, in his most important work, Being in Time, Dasein, which is how he refers to the conscious human being, is thrown into the world at birth and has no choice over the body, the family, the culture, or the society that he is thrown into. For Heidegger, thrownness is one of the givens of existence. It means that there are limits to our freedom, and these limits are situated in a particular historic moment. It's the moment we are born into the culture we are born into. Equally, those who fled the war in March and ended up on a bus to Chamonix, for example, which is the town nearby where I live, had no idea where they were going or who would meet them at the end of that journey. This secondary experience of thrownness, the first being birth, has been the same for many refugees who left Ukraine and came to Europe. A week before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, my client Katya and her boyfriend Sasha had signed on a flat in a new build in Kiev. Sat before me in therapy, Katya would talk about that flat a lot. It had certainly massively devalued, and they hadn't even finished building it. She had wanted it so badly, and now she couldn't imagine herself living in it. She was dreaming, having experienced the nature of the Alps, of after the war, living in a small house in the countryside outside Kiev. Here she was, staying in a 4-star hotel temporarily in the Alps, but with a sense that the clock was ticking. Soon the tourist season would be upon us, and she and her daughter might be out on the street. She felt like she had woken up in a different reality, thrown from the Polish border to somewhere she had never even heard of before. She couldn't get her head around the suddenness and the incomprehensibility of this change in her life. She felt like a child, helpless, voiceless, amazed at how alien everything was, and at how little she understood. Another given for Heidegger is our mortality. We will all die, and we exist as being towards death while we open up to our existential anxiety. This all sounds rather bleak, but in fact, as Hans Kohn writes, Heidegger's thrownness is no trap, but a fact, a present situation with its own possibilities. Possibilities imply the presence of choices. Facing our own mortality, Heidegger says, we can learn to live more authentically. And I'm going to return to this idea of possibilities and authenticity later in this talk. I'm quoting Heidegger here because I find the concept of thrownness useful in the context of involuntary migrants, but considering this is a presentation about the victims of war, I'm quoting him reluctantly. His support of the Nazi regime and the fact that many who quote him do not mention this has always been deeply troubling for me. I refer to Mark Bose's recent book, An Existential Approach to Interpersonal Trauma, which I would highly recommend, where he writes, there is an absurdity in using Heidegger's work when his ideas are saturated in the blood, sweat, and tears of his own inauthenticity and his avoidance of the realities of his participation in his existence and historical thrownness. What I've witnessed in my refugee clients is a true existential assault. Accompanying them on this journey, I have experienced a powerful sense of the things we take for granted in life. And here I quote American Jewish existential psychotherapist Irvin Yalom to explain how the 4 givens of the human condition intersect with this experience. Yalom writes, I mean by givens of existence, certain ultimate concerns, certain intrinsic properties that are a part and an inescapable part of the human being's existence in the world. And I'm going to talk through them and how they relate to the refugee experience in the order that he presents them in his 1980 book, Existential Psychotherapy. Firstly, death. I've observed an ever-present fear of death in many of my Ukrainian clients, those whose husbands are serving on the front line or simply going about their daily lives in areas that are under attack. But there's another fear of death. There's a fear of the death of their life as they've always known it, a fear that they'll never be able to return to the life they had before, a death of their culture and their society. In France, there's the added fear for their own survival. Secondly, freedom. Now, refugees have no choice over basic things such as where they came to in Europe and where they will live until they can find a way to make their own living. There are still some freedoms within this thrownness, everyday choices that seem so important and yet so uncertain, such as whether to stay or to go, whether to take said job or not, whether to accept this offer of housing or wait for something better. Within the choice to leave Ukraine, there is a huge sense of guilt, as most men could not leave and so many stayed behind out of choice. Thirdly, isolation. Not knowing the language means isolation. Leaving loved ones behind means isolation. But then there's another kind of isolation that I've observed. Falling out with loved ones over views on the war is also a source of isolation, as is generally feeling that you don't agree with those around you on something so significant. I'll come back to this idea when I talk about my male Russian clients. And lastly, meaninglessness. In the shock of losing the structure of one's everyday life, work, relationships, infrastructure, and having one's country and culture come under attack, there's a huge loss of meaning. I'm going to present today a mental health program I developed within a community Ukrainian refugee project in the Chamonix Valley, which is not far from where I live in the French Alps. It has a population of 15,000 with a further 80,000 tourist beds. And in winter, as most of you will know, it's a ski resort. In summer, it's a hiking and climbing destination. And it has about, last figure I heard was about 5 million visitors every year. And in the middle of March, 3 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, a local politician funded a bus to go to the Polish border and come back with Ukrainian refugees that were to be looked after by local volunteers. A group of volunteers arranged temporary housing with local families. Many of those families are British. There's a big British population in Chamonix. The volunteers delivered weekly food boxes, opened bank accounts, registered the Ukrainians with the local authorities, helped them get state benefits, got the children into local schools, and helped the mothers find seasonal work. I volunteered to provide Russian language therapy to those in need of it. And 2 weeks after they arrived, I was approached by a local donor who had heard of a couple of individuals really suffering quite a lot from the trauma that they had witnessed. He approached me to ask me to assess 40 adult refugees who had arrived and to offer ongoing therapy to those who I felt were in need of it. And they came from all over Ukraine, as this map shows. This was relatively early in the conflict. So there was a large proportion that came from Bucha, where there was a particularly brutal attack early on, and 10 came from what is now Russian occupied Ukraine. In terms of the demographics, 36 out of 40 had Russian as a first language, and 36 of them were women. There were 4 men. In general, men cannot leave the country. There are some exceptions to that rule. One of them was over the age of 60, so he could leave. There was an individual who's been working as a humanitarian worker, so he's got quite a lot of free movement between Europe and Ukraine. One of them was already outside Ukraine when the war started, and one, I'm not entirely sure how he left. There were 8 over the age of 60, 5 adult pre-university age, only 7 with higher education. And I think this is just a point I want to emphasize, is that these individuals I've been working with have largely come from very underprivileged backgrounds, without professional qualifications or higher education. There was some ethnic diversity, one family from Azerbaijan, one Sri Lankan Ukrainian who's married to a Ukrainian national, one Crimean Tatar family with Ukrainian passports, and one family of Romani descent with 6 children, 1 adult. In terms of the assessment process for those who are interested, I use the Gates Foundation Pathways to Wellness Refugee Health and Wellbeing Screener. I found this questionnaire really valuable in addition to the in-depth assessment that I did, because it asks the individual to think about their mental health before the war broke out, during the process of migration, and when I met them. So this allowed me to get a sense of what kind of a state they were in already, what kind of, whether there were already any signs of depression or anxiety. And it also gave me a sense of their kind of inherent resilience. Resilience is something that I've thought about a lot in working with refugees. The questionnaire also asked them to do using a distress scale to do a self-assessment of their level of distress. And I found that 25% expressed extreme distress, but most of them were kind of in the middle range. In my 1-hour assessment with each of them, I covered the following issues: what they had experienced with the outbreak of war, how they had experienced it, what their experience of migration was, whether they had loved ones back in Ukraine and where those loved ones were. What were their immediate concerns and worries? A lot of this was about immediate ability to survive and look after their children. Symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidal ideation, whether they were on medication already. Quite a lot of them had been given anti-anxiety medication on the Polish border. A sense of their resilience, as I've mentioned, how they were feeling about facing this enormous challenge that had been thrown at them, what the quality was of their existing and childhood relationships, any signs of substance abuse. There were they were mainly women, 36 women, so any experience of domestic violence, and how they were coping as parents. Immediate concerns that came up, I found that 40% of them were desperate to go home, 25% of them were extremely distressed. I made 3 immediate psychiatric referrals into the French system via a local family doctor, and then I accompanied them as a translator into the psychiatric services. I found that really supportive and helpful and wonderful. I was really impressed. Ukrainians have been given a great response here in terms of healthcare, free healthcare. I found that only 2 individuals spoke English, none of them spoke French. Their priority request was to get help finding work. They were all incredibly anxious about how long the temporary accommodation would be available to them, obsessed with getting into healthcare. And the mothers were really, really struggling. I think there's another point that I wanted to make here that I don't have on this slide, which is about those from the older generation and from less privileged backgrounds were less open to therapy initially. They seemed reluctant about the idea of therapy. They were kind of laughing me off when I was suggesting that perhaps they might benefit from it. And in terms of that older generation, I found the general message was that life has always been hard for these women, and they've never talked about their struggles with a professional, so why should they start now? Psychotherapy isn't part of our culture, one of them told me during our first meeting. When I asked her why, she said, psychiatric hospitals were like prisons, your health records weren't secure, and revealing you had psychological problems has always been risky. Indeed, Ukraine, like much of the former Soviet Union, has a rather disturbing history when it comes to mental health care. A 2019 study showed that of people internally displaced by military conflict in Ukraine since 2014, only 74% of those who likely required mental health support, 74% of those who likely required mental health support had not actually received it. One of the women I spoke to, one of the older women I spoke to said, what's happening is a nightmare. I never thought my daughter would face war, but nothing's ever been easy. This is our cross to bear. We'll get through this. We get through everything. What I have found with the older generation is that therapy framed as a chat over a cup of tea is far more palatable to them. I have done home visits to 2 older women who have really struggled with migration. It's much harder to accept being a refugee in your 50s and your 60s than it is in your 30s or your 20s. And depression is very, very common in this group. Our volunteers found that older women regularly asked to go and see a GP, and I myself have spent some time in A&E with the grandmother in the family we've been looking after. Most of those I met during assessment wanted to know what I thought of Russia's actions in Ukraine and why on earth I speak Russian. And there was a little bit of kind of suspicion and mistrust around this. And this brings me onto the first of several elements of this work that I've reflected on as essential. The idea that in the context of this war, building trust in the therapeutic space means not avoiding the political. To return to my client, Katya, politics and cultural reflection have been ever present in her therapy. She has often expressed grief over falling out with her pro-Russian relatives who did not approve of the fact that she left in the first place. Though Katya now lives in Kiev, she was born in Melitopol in Zaporizhia Oblast, the Ukrainian south, on the road to Crimea, and a 3-hour drive from Mariupol, which today lies in ruins. In October 1941, the Germans murdered the entire Jewish population of Melitopol, and this is now Russian-occupied Ukraine. And all Katya's relatives believed, at least at the start of the war, that the Russians had come to liberate them. Katya never believed this. She told me in our 5th session that her sister had been writing toxic stuff to her, things like, if Natasha, her daughter, decided to get a swastika tattoo, would Katya disown her? Katya said she didn't understand the question. We're not Nazis, she said. But you support the Nazis, don't you? Her sister asked her. Katya ignored the comment. She said that whatever Natasha does, she would never disown her. Natasha is her daughter and the person she loves most in the world. I asked Katya what it meant to her to feel this conflict within her own family. And she told me it hurt enormously. She said she's fallen out with so many people since the war started, people she's known her whole life. It's incredibly painful. And then she said, but maybe I don't need these people. There's a deep sense of isolation in this conflict of views between Katya and her family, and isolation that has been felt by many throughout this war. From the beginning, the invasion has been carefully positioned in Russia as a special military operation to liberate oppressed ethnic Russians. A consequence has been a heightening of anti-Russian language sentiment in Ukraine, a tendency that predates the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014. According to one recent survey, those who consider Ukrainian their native language has increased from 57 to 80% over the past 10 years. And then there's the 2019 law of Ukraine, which made the Ukrainian language compulsory in most areas of civic life, including in schools and higher education. One highly educated Russian-speaking Ukrainian refugee whose family speak English among themselves out of choice, and who himself prefers to do therapy with me in English, made me reflect on the Russian language differently. I'm not the same person when I speak Russian, he explained. The Russian language is shaming, conflict-prone. English is indirect, polite, more optimistic. Russian is nostalgic, heavy, brutal. English is the language for psychology, for subtlety. It helps when you can be indirect. You can't be indirect in Russian. And I found this so fascinating to hear. The point is, language is not just a means to communicate. It reflects who we are, how we relate, how we experience the world. To speak the language of the invader is troubling. A client recently told me she was raised to see the German language as evil. She still experiences a bodily reaction whenever she hears it. I can't feel this way about my own language, surely, she said. As I said earlier, most of the refugees I have worked with speak Russian at home, and most come from eastern or southern Ukraine, the main targets of Putin's war. Their Ukrainian is often equally fluent, and a few speak Syrzhyk, a Ukrainian-Russian mix. This linguistic complexity says so much about the conflict. Many of the Ukrainians I have been working with have mixed roots, some with relatives still in Russia, some with pro-Russian relatives still in Ukraine. When we first introduced my services, I received an anonymous accusation. How dare you offer to help us in the language of the invader? It said, you must be in the Russian camp. The message came from a Ukrainian volunteer whom in the end I never met. And on that particular occasion, I didn't answer. I didn't really know how to answer. But in the therapeutic space, I have been questioned many times on how I feel about the war and about Russia, because they know I lived in Russia. And Van Derzen has written about this. She refers to Dinesh's phenomenological research with Iranian political refugees when she writes that it is important not to avoid political discussions. These people need to be able to freely express their political views and frustrations. Their first concern is often whether or not the therapist is their ally against the regime they have fled from. Van Derzen also asks, would we expect women who are victims of sexual assault or sexual abuse to accept therapy from someone of the same gender as their abuser and who held misogynistic beliefs? Equally, one might ask whether we would expect a Ukrainian refugee to be in therapy with a Russian national who calls the war a special military operation. The point is that in the context of war, your political views as an individual matter enormously. There is no hiding them. This is important because to feel fully seen by me, my Ukrainian clients need to trust me, and their ability to trust is brittle. To them, I am a foreigner in another foreign land. I'm a foreigner in another foreign land and speaking a highly politicized language. I quote The Ungrateful Refugee here, a book it's a beautiful autobiography by Dina Nayeri about her experience of being a child refugee leaving Iran with her mother and her brother, her experience of being a refugee in Dubai, Italy, and the US. As I write these pages, she says, I am confident that though refuge is undeniably today's battle, dignity is tomorrow's. What does she mean? I think Hannah Arendt summed it up best in her 1943 essay on the experience of being a German Jewish refugee in America. I found this article incredibly moving and very relevant to what I have witnessed in my Ukrainian clients in terms of their loss of control and extreme discomfort at the idea of being helped. If we are saved, we feel humiliated, she writes, and if we are helped, we feel degraded. Nayeri has written about this too, describing how she remembers her family being treated by volunteers as a refugee child. Even the most good-hearted want to feel thanked, she writes. They have come for that silent look of admiration that's free to most, but so costly if you're tapped for gratitude by everyone you meet. Among my clients, the feeling of being patronized, helped, or even dismissed like an ignorant child is often crippling. These experiences erode their sense of dignity. They feel like they can do nothing for themselves. In the therapeutic space, a phenomenological approach encourages the client to explore her world, her experience, and make sense of it. In the process, the therapist brackets her own preconceptions and experience to understand as best she can what goes on in the client's mind, heart, life, and soul. To quote Van Derzen's Everyday Mysteries, as therapists, we need to foster an attitude of wonder about human existence. We should be willing to explore together with our clients the particular conditions of living and the specific responses to these conditions experienced by them. We should place as few obstacles in the way of this exploration as we can. We should train ourselves to become more and more flexible so as to extend ourselves beyond the scope of our usual worldview. I have found the not knowing of my foreignness is almost an advantage here. Never have I worked so phenomenologically as a therapist. As a professional working in Russian, a language in which I have never studied psychotherapy, I craft every question, every reflection. I'm never lazy. My fear that I will miss something means that I believe I pay attention in a qualitatively different manner, and I frequently check I have not misunderstood. My experience is not unique, and Beverly Costa has written a lot about this. I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of her work. Therapists working across languages have been found to be more careful in how they use and interpret language, and this can certainly be an advantage. One of my clients, Kira, told me poignantly about her early experience of shopping alone in Chamonix. She tried to utter a few words in English and was met by a harsh glance from the woman behind the counter and rapid words in French. She lowered her eyes, deeply ashamed at how stupid she must look and how harshly she was judged, and because she couldn't understand anything. And she recalled in that moment being called to the blackboard as a child, aged 7 or 8, and being asked to write down words that she was meant to have learned by heart and she couldn't remember, and she was told she was stupid. This was the level of shame she connected to in that moment in that French supermarket. I remember feeling her shame profoundly. I remember the silence we held together, looking each other in the eyes after she told me about it. There was a feeling that in sharing that shame, she could move beyond it, a feeling of restoring dignity. Dignity is equally about the conditions refugees are forced to live in, the fact they cannot work in their former professions because they don't have the language or they don't have the relevant qualifications, and the fact they're dependent on state handouts. 2 families I work with have been accepted by the Red Cross to supposedly get council housing in France. They were told they would be given council housing in several weeks, but first they had to move into a hostel where their individual cases would be studied by a social worker. They were given less than a day to pack their bag in the temporary housing they were housed in Chamonix, before they were taken 3 hours away to another town and put in this hostel. And I work with both mothers in these families. When I spoke to them next, they said that the hostel was horrific and poorly run. Children had not been enrolled in school, which is illegal in France. Families from Mariupol had been waiting for months for apartments, having been promised they would get them in 2 weeks. And they were living in shared dormitories, several families in a dormitory. The Red Cross had lied to them. And if they walk away from this hostel, they lose their chance at state housing. If they stay, they feel their dignity has been stripped of them. In all of these degrading experiences of being an involuntary migrant, therapy can play an important role. It is a place where one does not feel judged or belittled by the circumstances one finds oneself in. One can be seen fully, be held, be accepted and understood, see and be seen. In a way, what I'm stating here is obvious, and it's true of all therapy, the basic condition of the potential for therapeutic change, what Carl Rogers wrote about as the minimal relationship. In this relationship, the therapist must be congruent, genuine. She is freely and deeply herself. In the context of refugee therapy, she is seeing the refugee as a person, not defined by legal status or homelessness, and she is bringing her genuine self to that process. Meeting this individual as an individual herself, perhaps more authentically and openly than she has ever been with any other client. The difference is that involuntary migrants regularly feel like subhumans outside therapy. They become increasingly suspicious of how others view them. They don't want help, yet they need it. They find it hard to trust. They fear being patronized. Authenticity on the part of the therapist is essential in this process. And I thought it might be useful to present myself as I've presented myself in therapy with my Ukrainian clients. At different times, I have been questioned on elements of me that I have never shared with clients before. I list the sides of me that I have shared in response to very direct questions that I think you can imagine from the answers I give. Russian is my second language. I began learning at age 14. I've had therapy in Russian, and I've worked with both Ukrainian and Russian clients for several years now. I did a degree in Russian language, literature, and history. I lived in Moscow for 14 years, working largely in the NGO sector, organizations focused, among other things, on human rights and freedom of speech, concepts that today sound laughable in the Russian context. I have Russian friends who have been arrested and lost their jobs, and many of my Russian friends now live in exile. I've been to Kiev twice, and one of my best friends is Ukrainian. She's from Nikolaev, and several of her relatives have been living with us on and off since the beginning of the war. News of the war affected me strongly. I could not sleep, eat, or concentrate on anything but the newsfeed for weeks after. It's the first time in my life I've lost weight out of anxiety. I left Russia with a deep sense of dread in 2017, taking our 3 boys with me to Spain because my husband wasn't ready to leave. And quite frankly, after 14 years of Russian winter and during Brexit, Britain didn't look very appealing, and Britain still doesn't look very appealing. I spent 3 years trying to make a home in Catalonia and feeling more of an outsider there than I ever felt in Russia. We moved to the Alps because of the pandemic. I understand what it feels to be afraid of Putin and to be foreign, but I can't claim to understand what it feels like to run from war. British poet Warsan Shire, who migrated with her Somali parents from Kenya to the UK in 1989, has helped me understand with her writing and several podcasts I've listened to. She's a remarkable individual. Home is her poem about the experience of being forced to leave by war. I'm reading just a few excerpts here, but I recommend the full poem if you haven't already read it. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burned threats into your neck. And then she also in this poem talks about what it feels like to be other. How do the words, the dirty looks, roll off your back, maybe because the blow is softer than a limb torn off? As late as the eve of war, the 23rd of February of this year, none of my Ukrainian clients believed that Russia would launch a wide-scale invasion of Ukraine. It seems unbelievable now that they might have been so naive, but then so many of us were, myself included. Waking up to sirens and a declaration of war in their own country was the ultimate calamity, an existential crisis of the most onerous kind. And I give an example here of one client I worked with for the first weeks after her arrival in France. Here, I'll call her Tanya. Tanya comes from Bucha. She spent 2 weeks in a basement with her family before being evacuated. She was the first Ukrainian I met in Chamonix. And we met that first time in the basement apartment she was being housed in. It had no windows, and I remember that I wished she had been given a flat with windows, but there was no choice. Since arriving on the bus, she had not left that flat because she was terrified of the outside world. She told me of her grandmother being dragged from a van by one of Kadyrov's men and held at gunpoint. Tanya had an empty gaze in her eyes. She said she was having nightmares every single night and couldn't sleep. And we met weekly from then on. I was given a disused cafe for my sessions, and now Tanya came to me. The walk across town was initially part of the therapy. The first time we did that walk together, I felt Tanya's deep need for connection and love and overwhelming loneliness, expressed in detailed descriptions of her exchanges on Tinder. I was reminded of my work with Tanya when reading Van Derzen's Rising from Existential Crisis. Here she writes about individuals, refugees who have actually experienced torture and war, feeling persecuted and facing a level of insecurity that can ravage their entire sense of identity, belonging, and value. They will feel shattered and devastated. Such people need to be helped gently to refine their bearings, not just physically and socially, but from a psychotherapeutic and philosophical perspective. Once Tanya had shared the reality of the trauma of what she had witnessed and experienced back home and on the journey to the border, once she had confronted it in language, she began to sleep. She began also to venture out into the world. Tanya is physically strong and familiar with hard work. She was towards the end of a degree in pharmacology and was doing a lot of menial jobs to support herself. A job for her in Chamonix meant financial independence from her family. She was desperate to move out, and she jumped at the offer of a job working in a hotel that came with accommodation. The job indeed created a shift in her. I saw through this transition that Tanya began to express herself differently and to look differently at her experience of migration as something that had given her a new direction in life, an opportunity. She began to build a relationship with one of her colleagues, also a migrant, though from a different country. And we reflected together on how this war had certainly turned her life upside down and terrified her, but also opened up an entire new chapter in her life. In working with Tanya and several other Ukrainians I've worked with, I've thought many times of the life and work of Viktor Frankl, in particular, his experience of surviving the Holocaust and finding meaning in suffering. Building on his own extraordinary biography, Frankl proposed in logotherapy 3 different values we can use to find meaning in suffering. The first is by creating something or doing something: work, creation, action. The second is by connecting with someone and loving someone deeply, that connection on a level of a spirit level. And I don't, if you've read Man's Search for Meaning, you'll remember that in the concentration camp, he held on to memories of his beloved wife, even though he didn't know whether she had survived or not. The third, through attitude. He writes, even the helpless victim of a hopeless situation, facing a fate he cannot change, may rise above himself, may grow beyond himself, and by so doing change himself. He may turn a personal tragedy into a triumph. Another remarkable practitioner I have drawn on is Holocaust survivor and psychologist Edith Egger, who was born to Hungarian Jewish parents in what was then Czechoslovakia. And she became a member of the Hungarian Olympic gymnastics team in 1942. In 1942 was thrown out for being Jewish. In 1944, she ended up in Auschwitz with her mother. She was separated from her mother, and her mother was murdered in the gas chambers. Egger then survived several more concentration camps. With no higher education, she emigrated to the States with another Jewish survivor whom she met when she was in recovery for extreme starvation in hospital. If all this were not extraordinary enough, Egger went on to read and become friends with Frankl, to train to become a clinical psychologist. She qualified when she was in her early 50s, and she went into therapy. For years, she had not talked about her trauma with her children, and that had created all sorts of problems. And therapy and her training changed that, allowing her to open up to how the trauma had limited her. Egger's writing in The Choice and the Gift offer beautiful descriptions of how therapy can help in the face of circumstances beyond our control. Attitude isn't everything, she writes. We can't erase hardships or make ourselves well with our outlook alone. but how we spend our time and mental energy does affect our health. If we resist and rail against what we're experiencing, we take away from our growth and healing. Instead, we can acknowledge the awful thing that is happening and find the best way to live with it. I refer here to one 39-year-old mother of 3 called Irina, whom I worked with for 12 sessions, and who discovered in the first few weeks of being a refugee in Chamonix that her husband had been cheating on her. In fact, the evidence had always been there before her eyes, she admitted, but she had chosen to ignore it. The massive upheaval of forced migration had almost snapped her out of a sense of reverie and forced her to face the truth. Therapy for her became a space to process the shock of this realization that she had been betrayed by her husband for many years. He had an entirely other family and other children. For several sessions, this was all she could talk about. She felt incredibly bitter and hard done by. She had a sense that she had wasted her life. She had never had a job, and this was his fault too, though she had been to university. Now she found herself in another country with no work experience behind her and no languages, and she didn't know how she was going to support herself and her children. To return to Dinesh's study of Iranian political refugees, as referred to by Van Derzen, his participants found the most inner strength when they were willing and able to tap into the inner resources that allowed them to be adaptable. If we find the inner elasticity to start imagining ourselves and our lives anew, we can adjust to many more challenges than we ever thought possible. In psychotherapy, Irina began to tap into those inner resources. She began to dream about staying in France. She realized that the one thing she had spent her adult life doing, which was keeping a beautiful home for her children, was a skill that in the tourist town she found herself in could actually earn her good money. She got herself a job cleaning in a 5-star hotel and started going to French classes. Her 12-year-old son was enjoying school, and she started to talk about how if he could learn fluent French, it would change everything. Their whole future would change, and she could leave behind her husband's betrayals. I end on something that I don't know if there are some people to whom this might appear inappropriate in a presentation that is largely about my work with Ukrainian refugees, but I would like to talk about 2 Russian clients I have been working with this year and before this year. Tens of thousands of Russian men have arrived in Tbilisi, Georgia, since Putin announced partial mobilization 2 weeks ago. I'm in touch with a close Russian friend who escaped to Tbilisi with her husband and children at the very beginning of the war because her husband is a high-profile campaigner in Russia, and it would have been risky for them to stay. She says the residents of Tbilisi, which is a city of about 1 million people, are rather nervous to have all these extra Russian men suddenly descend upon them. Other Russian men avoiding mobilization have gone to Turkey, Israel, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and even South Korea. Those privileged few with Schengen visas have come to Europe. None of those in Europe will be treated as refugees. Russians are now pariah in Europe. Psychotherapeutic services have been set up to support those Russians fleeing or avoiding mobilization. I work with 2 such individuals myself. One of these has been my client since long before the war. His name is Ilya, and he's 20. If he had stayed in Russia, he would now be in the army, and he might even be dead. His parents, who are far from well off, spent all their savings to send him away to study when he was 16 in 2018, so he would not be conscripted into the army. They could see the war coming. For 2 years during the pandemic, they could not visit him because Russians could not get visas, and he could not go home because of the risk of conscription. When he first contacted the clinic I was working in Spain at the time, he was suffering from agoraphobia and panic disorder. He was not meeting anyone. He had had panic attacks before. They had returned that August, and now he could not leave the flat. It was September 2020, and we met online weekly. He had been put on a heavy dose of antidepressants and was using diazepam to cope with his anxiety. Strange though it sounds now that I know Ilya so well, it took us several sessions to make the connection between the return of his panic attacks and the poisoning of opposition politician Alexei Navalny. The panic attacks had begun soon after Ilya discovered that Navalny was in a coma. Ilya is a deeply political and ethically minded individual. He is gently spoken. He has an intelligence and care and a maturity about him that I have always found remarkable. He is training to be a developer via an online institute. He has never been to university. His knowledge of world affairs and politics and his sensitivity towards other cultures are extraordinary. But he is deeply uncomfortable in his own skin, and it's the Russianness of that skin that makes him uncomfortable. What is happening in his country, the fact he can't go home and be free, the fact he does not have a sense of belonging anywhere in the world, and he fears he will never belong anywhere in the world. He works on his accent in Spanish and English so that his Russianness will not be noticed. Ilya made progress through therapy. There was something important about being able to express his outrage, to have that outrage held and understood. As in Dinesh's work with Iranian political refugees, I did not hide my own feelings about Putin's regime. I acknowledged the fact that at times I myself felt deeply anxious and afraid living in Moscow. This was about building trust, allowing Ilya to know that he was not alone, far from it. I accompanied him during telephone sessions out of his flat. I would follow him on Google Maps as he described the route he was taking, and he read out street signs to me. He told me the names of shops and described the people who passed him. And I asked him to find a bench to sit on so he could observe the world and tell me how it felt to be a part of it. He described the Catalan grandmothers sitting at the bench opposite him, chatting animatedly. I asked him how he was feeling, and he said he felt okay, though he was scared someone might notice him, that he might have a panic attack and they would think he was mad, but for now he was okay. The world began to appear less frightening, less alien, less full of hatred for who he was as an individual in the world. The panic attacks began to lessen. He began to go outside on his own. Eventually, he came off his medication. But the invasion of Ukraine brought back an overwhelming sense of feeling hated, despised, deeply ashamed in his own skin for Ilya. And sometimes the anxiety would get so bad that the panic attacks would return. But he has not gone back on medication. He has managed to hold himself through this crisis, taking care of his sick mother, who by coincidence managed to get a visa and come and visit him just before the war started, and has stayed with him ever since. Having her with him has been a blessing, but also created a whole new range of difficulties. Her first application for refugee status was, of course, rejected. He's been working tirelessly to get her medical insurance and finally succeeded. He tells her not to speak to him in Russian out on the street because he doesn't want anyone to know where they're from. The shame is still frequently overwhelming. My other Russian client is someone I began working with after Russia invaded Ukraine in early March. Oleg was a former soldier in his early 20s from a modest background in the Russian regions, and he was living in Moscow when we met. He was gripped by overwhelming anxiety and insomnia with news of the invasion. He had been to the doctors and was taking an anti-anxiety medication. Over the following weeks and months, he talked a lot about the attitudes within his close circle. His parents were pro-Putin. Most of his friends talked about the war in terms that he did not agree with. He described to me what it felt like to walk down the street and see the Z sign on people's clothes. He said it felt as if everyone had been turned into zombies. He told me about the first coffin that came back to his hometown and how people had reacted with acceptance, which felt so shocking to him. He couldn't speak to anyone in his life about what he really thought about the war, how it really made him feel, because people had been seized by a strange patriotic frenzy. Even a well-known yoga teacher at a seminar he attended spoke in support of the invasion. This experience of seeing things differently from the way everyone around him was seeing things left Oleg feeling extremely lonely and isolated. It was important he met me, he said, because I allowed him to express things the way he really experienced and felt them. He could be honest with me about his outrage and his deep sense of shame about what was happening. Sometimes he would be silent in our sessions for long periods, and then he would apologize for that silence. When I asked him what came up for him in those silences, he said it was shame. I had once shared with him that I was working with Ukrainians too. And he said in those silences, he kept on thinking he was wasting my time, that the Ukrainians needed me more. He began to speak of a friend who had moved to Turkey in protest. And I asked him if it was something he had considered doing himself. And he said he had, but he couldn't leave his mother. It would break her heart. He had recently grown close to her. This was something he talked about a lot in therapy. She had given up drinking after years of alcohol abuse, and he sensed she needed him now more than ever. Practically speaking, he could leave, he said. Programmers in his company had left and were working remotely. In fact, he had been working remotely since the pandemic, and it really didn't matter where he worked from. Some more weeks went by, a lot more silence in our sessions. He would ask me each week how the Ukrainians were faring in France. And then one week when we met, he told me he had bought a one-way ticket to Turkey. He spoke of a weight having lifted. When he got there, he felt safe, and he felt in some ways at peace. He was still horrified by what was happening in his country's name, but he would not be a part of it. I end with a quote from Hannah Arendt's essay on refugees. A man who wants to lose his self discovers indeed the possibilities of human existence, which are infinite as is creation. But the recovering of a new personality is as difficult and as hopeless as a new creation of the world. There's a pessimism in this quote, a pessimism about the impossibility of individual change. In forced migration, there is indeed a loss of self, but also an opening of possibilities. This is a really difficult journey, and therapy can help as a place of unconditional support on this journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Very inspiring. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So this is an opportunity for us all to maybe share some ideas that came up through that session with Amy, or to ask Amy questions or ask questions of each other about this. So would anyone like to begin that process? We have 30 minutes off, near enough. So Amy, is that okay? Would you be happy to explore some other ideas with people?
Yeah.
So you can do this either by verbally, by putting your microphones on, or on the chat, and I'll read out the messages on the chat if you choose that format. Okay, well, we can wait. But one of the things that I kind of felt very strongly came over, Amy, is that sense of commitment and desire in you to create that sort of independent relationship with each of the people you were working with. And that sense of thrownness that you must have experienced as this situation developed, and the thrownness for your family too, and your commitment to that sense of wanting to go into the arena of supporting and working with these people. Would you like, if that's okay, to say a bit more about what that experience has meant for you as a mum, as a wife, as a professional working with this very unexpected thrownness, and then bringing up this care and this passion and this integrity that seems to have come across very clearly tonight in that lecture?
Yeah, Neil, thank you for asking that, because it's interesting in having the time to actually take a step back and reflect on it and present it. It's actually been very therapeutic for me, because it has been an enormous transformation, not only in my life, but in my family's life. I took 2 terms out of my studies, and I basically devoted myself to this work. And, you know, I feel so deeply changed by these wonderful Ukrainians who have entered my life. I can see a colleague sitting there who understands what I'm talking about, Sarah. Sarah is also based in the Alps and also works with the Ukrainians. So, you know, it's something that kind of, obviously it came out of nowhere. It came out of nowhere for everybody, what has happened, this horrific development. And the work just took over. And it's been an incredibly moving and important experience. And it's made me look very differently at my own life, my experience of being a foreigner, my experience of having chosen to be a foreigner. You know, there's almost this question of why would anyone choose this when it is so painful, when it's forced upon people. I think the endless uncertainty now, how much longer this is going to continue for, is what is so painful in this work. So it's kind of sitting with that uncertainty. I don't really mean for me, I mean for the people I work with.
Amy, you have your hand raised. I'm sorry, I didn't see it before. Amy Kemp, would you like
That's
to?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I almost didn't out of shyness, but Amy, thank you so much. What you've been doing is amazing, just incredible. And one of the things that really struck me is what you said about, in this circumstance with psychotherapy, it is important to be transparent about your political views, which really, you know, it really struck me. And what, as you know, I'm doing a lot of work with Ukrainian refugees in Krakow. Actually, one of the things that we're seeing also is the massive impact on the Polish community and on the Polish women and children, and the dynamics of the support that they also need. I wonder whether you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I do. Hi, Amy. Thank you for coming. It's nice to see you. Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, and I have provided some support to individuals in Chamonix. It's very hard to, I don't know if what you're talking about, people who have actually been hosting people in their homes, because I think that has been something that's been very hard for people. There are expectations. People go into it with very good will, and there are certain expectations, and there are a lot of things you have no control over, and this war is going on for a long time. And, you know, you may have opened your home thinking it's just for a few months, and it ends up being endless. There's that, and then there's massive cultural shocks. I don't know if that's something that you come across in Poland. Maybe there's more of a closeness in culture between Ukraine and Poland, but I found like communication something I've had to help with between Ukrainians and local people and British people who are hosting people. And I think that ongoing, I feel like there needs to be more of that kind of support for the volunteers and the hosts.
Yeah, what we're finding is we have these community centers that we've started in Krakow, and the Ukrainian women are leaning in so hard in terms of running it. So we're going there in the beginning of December to help them really take it over with our full support. But there's a lot of dynamics in the community with the Polish women who perhaps haven't had access to affordable childcare or language lessons or psychotherapy, which we're also providing, you know, so it's very delicate. Yeah,
I can imagine. That's amazing. How many people are you helping there in that center?
We've helped in the community of Dybniki, we have 100-odd families, so almost 300 people. Wow. But then we have, in our psychotherapy center, we have 3 full-time psychotherapists who just work, you know, full time. And we've worked hard to find Ukrainian speakers too, which has been difficult to find the people with the right qualifications and the language skills.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That sounds brilliant.
Amy, may I ask a question on behalf of Tally? She says, or he says, excuse me, Tally. Thanks so much, Amy. You've been doing an enormous job. As I'm more experienced working and researching voluntary migrants, I wonder if you could say more about choices, choicefulness, and working with freedom and choice with those with limited freedom. Thanks.
Wow, that's a really good question. I think that it's a really difficult one, I have to say, because I feel like I'm really up against it now with these two families who have faced this situation through the Red Cross, where they're literally waiting to find out when and where they will get an apartment, and they don't have any influence over it. And that's a horrible feeling. I feel that that difference, where I think I said that earlier in the presentation, that for me, the big difference between voluntary and involuntary migrants is choice, choice over circumstance. There is very little choice. Perhaps we can talk about choice more in terms of a kind of Frankel approach to choice, this idea of like attitude and building connections and quality human relationships and building a sense of community, because I think that's really important when you're experiencing this kind of lack of choice. I don't know if that answers your question at all, Tali.
I don't know. Okay, maybe Tali can come back with some response there, but Natalie's asking, I have a question. What advice would you give to people who want to work with refugees who have little or no experience, who might feel moved to, but fearful of not being able to support these clients, especially with language barriers to consider too?
Oh, that's cool, Tali. I understand.
Oh, you can see
okay,
this
I understand now, because I thought you're usually quite vocal. Okay, that's cool. Safe journeys. Okay, so you see, it's really interesting. I had no experience of working with refugees, and I thought about this when I put this presentation together. I'm not presenting today as an expert at all. I've gone into this as an experience that kind of came my way and I embraced. And I feel that so often we go into working with a new client group and we don't know anything about their life experience. We haven't had their life experience. And I feel like coming at it from a position of wonder and openness is all we can do. And I do remember my first week of working with the refugees and them coming in one after another, and I was doing these assessments, and it was just so incredibly moving, and I just felt filled up with energy and stories. I didn't feel, oh, I shouldn't be doing this. I didn't feel that kind of sense of I'm not qualified. They just needed someone to listen. And language, I'm really interested in that question, because I don't know. I've thought about, why have I never worked with refugees before? Is it because, I think it's because I didn't feel I had the cultural or the linguistic qualification to do so. And I don't know about working with a translator. I know that Beverly Costa has this whole program, and like they meet, they have these wonderful groups and meetups, and there are lots of therapists who are trained to work. I mean, translators trained to work with therapists. And I'm sure there are some wonderful professionals who really can do that. I know that when I was working as a translator in the French psychiatric system between French and Russian, and neither of those are my native language, so that was probably making it harder, I felt things were being lost, and I was really trying to do my best. Yeah, something was being lost. So I don't know. I feel like I don't know if I would work with a translator doing therapy, having had that experience.
Seeing if there's any more hands up. No hands up. I don't want to miss anyone. Okay.
That's great, Natalie. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I can't see what to say. What did Natalie say then?
That I've had the same experience understanding them with phenomenological curiosity as a human rather than labeling as a refugee. Part of my asking this question was to have it on record to inspire more to go for it. Thank you for your answer. Yeah.
Anyone else would like to say something or ask or comment?
Hi everyone. Amy, thank you so much. Such a moving presentation, and I think we all are processing still what you've said. I guess for me, I would like to ask you about trust. You've mentioned trust on a couple of occasions, and as we know, as psychotherapists, trust is quite important within the therapeutic room. Have you noticed a shift with, you know, such a difficult group and range of people that you are working with? And when would that shift come in, if any, noticeable at any point? Or
I think, you know, it's interesting you say that. I was thinking about this when I was putting the presentation together. I think that the group that I've noticed it most in is the older generation, that there was such a distrust of me at the beginning, but not a kind of judgment of me, more like, why would I be interested in talking to them? What did I want from talking to them? And at the very beginning, there was a feeling of, I don't even know if I can, it felt insurmountable, really insurmountable. And I think, again, it's similar to my answer to Natalie. It was just sitting there and persisting and listening openly and making space and just trusting the process and knowing that once you trust the process, it begins, you know, doesn't it? It begins that connection, that openness, and it began to be of value. And then the trust comes, if that makes sense.
yeah, it does. Thank you.
I think what that captures is really that sense of the relationship you create with the client, and the client creates with you. That sense of it's always going to be unique and individual depending on the client, but that's it sounds really clear how important it always is, but particularly how important it is in these situations, that trust, that sense of overcoming all the difficulties and the tensions that seem to exist through language, through being displaced, completely displaced, and then working with someone who's perhaps not of the same language basis, traditions. That sense of development of the relationship seems really crucial and really important between you and the client.
I just saw Simon's question, which is so, yep. Simon, it's such an interesting question. I've thought about this so much in my work. I think the cross-generational trauma is just so ever present. And when I did the assessment and I mentioned the things that came up and the things I tried to cover in that first meeting, and there was a lot to cover, I really had a sense of where people had come from. And as I said, I've been working with some people from really underprivileged backgrounds, you know, people who have not been to university and have never left Ukraine before. And there was a real sense of what they had, the stories that they had from their parents and their grandparents, and the idea that this is kind of inevitable, what's happened, you know, this feeling that it doesn't surprise them. You know, they've known so much hardship, and war has always been there in the imagination. That's incredibly bleak and incredibly sad. In terms of like a lack of trust, in terms of pre-existing trauma, you know, caused by alcoholic parents, that's very much been present in my work.
I was just thinking about a close friend I had when I was young, whose father was Ukrainian. he came to the UK as a prisoner of war because he joined the German army to fight the Russians. And because my family had relatives who had fought against the Germans, and as a young person, it was quite difficult to get my head around. There must be all those kind of complications for everyone. That family, everyone in the family has a different stance on conflicts, like allegiances and conflicts.
Absolutely. I think they run really deep.
So Natalie asks, what has you been thrown in, sorry, missed it. What has you been thrown into this enormous task meant for you as a psychologist moving forward? Has this challenge inspired you to do anything, push forward with anything, including anything that we as your audience can support with or contribute to, either for the therapy field or humanity?
Well, yeah, Natalie, that's interesting coming from you. I think you're obviously like a real doer and really creative and amazing. I am trying to do my doctorate, but I have had moments of thinking I should just quit it and set up a therapy service. Maybe I should join you, Amy, in Poland and set up a therapy service for refugees, because I just feel like my work was just the tip of the iceberg. I feel like therapy could help these people so much. I did have a moment of wanting to change the topic of my dissertation, but it's a little bit late for that. I think that would set me back a year or so. In terms of anything you can support with, I don't know. I feel like it's such an enormous task, but I feel like I know that NSPC, well, Dilemma or NSPC has already been doing something. So it'd be interesting to look at that and see where that's going long term. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Natalie. Digby, what do you mean by what is the role of community with other involuntary migrants? Do you mean the connection between Ukrainians and other communities?
Well, I was really referring, Amy, can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
I was really referring to the work that Emmy has done here in our little village in Sussex.
Oh.
And has helped quite a few Ukrainians find families here. And it seems to me that the organizer, the sort of overall coordinator of that, has tried to create social events for those families. And the ones who've done best, I think, or that's my impression, have actually got a lot of support from creating their own community and their own events. So I wondered whether that's something that, how important that is, thinking that historically, you know, one hears of British communities in Southeast Asia and, you know, American communities in London, and how people seem to find sort of like-mindedness and sympathy, not just in psychotherapists, but in other people in comparable circumstances. I've
found in Chamonix, there's been a very strong sense of Ukrainian community. I don't think it's a place that has, actually there were Bosnian refugees housed in one of the gîtes that we've been using. So we did have one gîte from an association which was provided long-term to house several families. And previously they had used it for Bosnian refugees. But other than a sanatorium that is used, Sarah, I don't know if you know more about this, that is used to house some unaccompanied migrants from, where are they from?
They did, but they are unaccompanied migrants who turn up. There's also a group of people in Sallanches who look after refugees as well in a similar way. So I think there's quite a few grassroots things happening, and there have been for quite some time in Chamonix. I'm interested in your thoughts while we're talking just about the importance of that and the importance of local communities doing things compared to what you describe. And what I'm just learning about the situation with the Red Cross, and therefore how important it is to have this going on. At the same time, you know, should it really be left to groups to do this? These are all big questions that we've talked about, but I'm curious about that as well, the importance of the local community, but also it can't be left to the local community, although it's good to come from the local community. There's this dilemma all the time.
Yeah.
I think it's more that, isn't it more the community of, if there are a sufficient number of migrants themselves, it's their community that seems to be, because you can branch out from it's almost like the home that you've lost, isn't it? It's a kind of substitute. And then you can branch out into the wider communities you feel more comfortable. But to start in the wider community straight away is like losing your home, as Amy's described, in a sense, because you have to embrace new values and new languages and new cultures and new foods. Well, I mean, Amy explained all of that. So I'm just thinking that, I mean, the psychotherapist, in a sense, is a substitute for a community or a family, isn't it? We act as a surrogate for a period of time, especially in the way you are working, as you described it. But sometimes if you find a like-minded group of people who you immediately feel an affinity for, that might bypass the need to have a psychotherapist who projects themselves into your world and provides that kind of understanding and fellow feeling.
I think to add to, sorry, go on.
No. So carry on, Neil.
I was just going to suggest, maybe because we're coming towards the end, but continuing the topic of community a little bit, with Michael's question, have you seen a change in attitude from the local community towards refugees as time marches on and there is no clear end game?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. And I think, yes, definitely it's becoming harder and harder, which is why we are beginning to do things like turn to the Red Cross, because we realize this war is not ending and people need more social support. They don't have good enough language to integrate and be independent. Therefore, they need social housing while they're finding their feet. And I think that answers Ruth's question as well, that I think the mothers have really been struggling with the lack of language support in the French schools. I've heard Germany has been amazing and France is just terrible. There's just been no, we actually organized, Sarah and I were involved in organizing a French language school for some of the kids over the summer holidays, but we're talking 3 or 4 times a week. That's all we could get people to give their time for. And I just felt like the state was kind of not picking this up, or the schools were not picking this up. So children are really struggling, and parents without the language are struggling to support those children. Yeah, and Amy, I would love to come to Krakow at the beginning of December. That sounds great.